fiscal policy and monetary policy linkages and how these policy responses are there in the time of pandemic and geopolitical uncertainties. And some of you must have scanned through the newspapers or on Twitter that yesterday there was an important meeting in US, and that's Jackson Hole meeting. Jackson Hole meeting, we economists look forward to understand what is the kind of mood or the policy narratives which are going to get rolled out in US Fed Reserve. That is like our central bank in India. In the central bank of US, what is their policy perspectives, and why we look forward to this Jackson Hole meeting and the US Fed Reserve chair Jay Powell, his decisions, why we should be bothered about that. Because in the Western world, if they are deciding to increase their interest rates, unless RBI also increase the interest rate, there could be capital flight. So, we are very proud of our huge forex reserves. But the moment the capital becomes flighty, that's going to affect the forex reserve. It's going to affect the way we finance our SAD, the current account deficit. Because you understand, in your school, in your undergrad program, you know that in the BOP, we have a current account deficit and the capital account, right? Current and capital. So X minus M, that has gone up to 4% of GDP once upon a time. But now that's not the case. But the X minus M widening is one issue. But if we can comfortably finance that X minus M, export minus import gap, with the capital account, the capital flows, then Indian economy, economists are very comfortable. But when the capital becomes flighty, then the things will be different. And how the capital becomes flighty? Because a part of your foreign capital is hot money. Hot money always responds to interest rate differentials. So where there is an attractive interest rate, this hot money will fly to those countries. So RBI has to increase the interest rate to match that, what is happening in the Western world. Now, if one moment you yourself, think that you are the governor of RBI, so what is the decision you have to take? I will give you the scenario. On one hand, I mentioned about the capital flight. On the other hand, we have gone through a pandemic. Now it's a time of economic growth recovery. So for the economic growth recovery process, interest rate needs to be lower. Why? Because then the credit will be cheaper, investment will happen, and it will help in the economic recovery. But the moment we increase the interest rate, then the credit won't be cheaper, the loans will get costlier. So, it's not just one-to-one that whatever adjustment you do in the repo rate, it's not one-to-one with the economic growth process, but still interest rates are very crucial for economic growth recovery. So there is a policy dilemma. And we have done a lot in the time of pandemic by rolling out many policies as economic stimulus policy packages. And one of the prime narrative of the economic stimulus packages was to keep the interest rate, that repo rate, lower. Since May 2020, we kept it 4%. But now it's shooting up like anything. But we kept it low, for this economic growth recovery process. But today or tomorrow, normalization process is going to be a reality. We need to roll back those stimulus programs, okay? So what will happen when the normalization procedure starts? The interest rate will start mounting. Then the liquidity infusion we have given to the economy, we need to absorb back. So that happened usually through the repo rate. But now repo rate has become almost redundant. We introduced a new toolkit into the economy. So that monetary policy corridor is also very important, because that gives you the indication whether the monetary policy stance is neutral or accommodative. Accommodative means, we are, that wordings in the Monetary Policy Committee minutes, students should take a look into the Monetary Policy Committee minutes. That's there in the RBI website. So they have clearly, worded it. They told that it's not, they are into the neutral stance now, but it's like, it's like a withdrawal of accommodative phase. So that's a way. So when monetary policy becomes partially effective in terms of its impact on the growth process, because now monetary policy needs to respond to mounting inflation. So see the policy dilemma. So now there should be a policy coordination from the fiscal policy front, and fiscal policy is also remaining very accommodative, because you must be remembering, a few years back prior to the pandemic, we were not willing to hear a very high fiscal deficit number, because in our country we have a fiscal rule that is around 3% of GDP we need to maintain the deficit. So now deficit has increased up to 9% of GDP at the center. Then now it's plummeting to around 6%, and in the due course we have a medium-term fiscal consolidation path. And that fiscal consolidation is by 25-26 we need to maintain it at 4.5%. So why not 3? Why 4.5? Because a certain part of the deficit that comes through the off-budget liabilities. I know that it's a hot debate in Kerala as well, that when the numbers come, politicians question that this fiscal deficit number is not showing the entire deficit, that gap in our economy. Why so? Because the moment you talk about KIFBI and all, it's a kind of off-budget liability, but by definition it's not a part of fiscal deficit. That's why it's not there in the budget numbers. But it's a huge political economic question. Where is the transparency? Why are not showing up everything? So in the central government, they also do this, outside the purview, they go ahead with this off-budget liabilities and all, and they have OBB, off-budget borrowings. They kept it in an annexure, in a table, that this is the kind of borrowing we take which is not within the part of fiscal deficit. So that's a way. So incorporating this budget transparency, that's good process. You're keeping it transparent, that's good. But given this budget transparency, instead of 3% of GDP, we are now visualizing that the country can play around with 4.5% of GDP, your deficit. But still it's suffocating, because if the fiscal consolidation path is through expenditure compression rather than the tax buoyancy, then you need to cut down certain kind of expenditure. Over the years, we have adjusted at the center and the state governments, how we adjusted to the fiscal rules. We have curtailed the capital spending, and now we are at the receiving end. When the pandemic hits, our health expenditure is just 1% of GDP, and the gross capital formation in the economy was plummeting. So it's a kind of a weird situation. Now the narrative is high fiscal deficit, high debt is okay, if you can substantiate that by the use of deficit for capital formation in the economy. I know that this can be a point of debate, but if you're using it for the capital formation, then that's fine. So there's a way now we are substantiating that high public debt in our country. Another one, how do you look into the sustainability of the debt? When you understand the debt is not sustainable, there are two important parameters in macroeconomics. One is the real rate of interest. The other is real growth of economy. So you may take debt, but use it for growing. Debt, growth. But again, debt, growth, then it will become an Argentina style. But you have to grow out of debt. That means the growth of the economy, that G, needs to be greater than the real rate of interest. And what exactly is real rate of interest? That's a cost of credit, the cost of borrowing. So if the R is greater than G, then your debt is not sustainable. So you need to understand that whether is it possible for you to maintain that threshold ratio of 3% to GDP, or you need to play around with R and G. And we economists always argue that it's not a strict 3%, that is a suffocating space, like what has happened in the Maastricht Treaty. They also, in European Union, they also believe in that 3%. But look at this R and G. If you are growing out of your debt, that's fine for the asset creation. Another important debate is that we are not comfortable if we have high deficit or high debt, because there is an intergenerational equity question. So you are keeping the future generations in debt. So those kind of arguments how you face. But that intergenerational inequity question, I do argue that it will be an intergenerational equity if you're using the debt correctly for investing in the public infrastructure, because it crowds in. Many schools of thought in macroeconomics, like you have neoclassical, you have Keynesian, and neoclassical school of thought believe that if you have a laudable funds and if you are preempting this laudable funds to finance your deficit, what is available to the private corporate sector, that laudable funds is limited. This can increase the interest rate. So that's the way it is argued in the neoclassical school of thought. But it can be refuted. Even if you're preempting the resources to the financing the deficit, you're using it for the capital formation, then that, public infrastructure investment crowds in private corporate investment. So it's a kind of a crowding in. So India, in a way, refuted this neoclassical argument of crowding out by emphasizing that in the case of emerging country like India, it's important to have high capital formation. Because if you look at the GDP numbers meticulously, earlier it was like gross capital formation led growth. But now the narrative is it's consumption led. But consumption led GDP in the long run cannot be sustainable. So we need to go back to that gross capital formation. So it has to be high, because we were over adjusting to the fiscal rules at the cost of capital formation in the economy. Now, look at the economic growth model, and there is a beautiful paper by the Geeta Gopinath of IMF. So that paper, the title is "Cycle is Trend." Students have learned about business cycles, right? But in the context of an emerging country, we need to understand that this clear business cycles, dating it like low point and high point, dating the business cycles may not be an appropriate way to capture the growth phenomenon, because there won't be any clear business cycles in the context of economy. In the sense, in the pandemic, from the prior pandemic growth path, we understand that there is a dip, right? And this dip is not a deviation, so that if you keep your fiscal and monetary policy as counter-cyclical policy tools, then this dip will automatically go back in V-shape or U-shape recovery. It's not happening, because that dip may be a permanent scar. It's not cyclical. So if that drop from the earlier prior pandemic growth path is a permanent scar, then the cyclicality related policies may not work for the growth recovery process. You need to get into the structural reforms. And there are a lot of structural reforms that's happening in the Indian economy. Power sector is one of the important place where we need to do a lot of structural reforms. And we have done a study on the power sector. There was a tripartite memorandum of understanding between Ministry of Power, DISCOMs, that is a distribution company, power distribution company, and the state governments. In the sense, DISCOM is in crisis. In India, we have generated electricity which is sufficient for 100% electrification. But things are not working because the distribution companies are in mess. They are in loss. So with that tripartite memorandum, what we were trying to do is to absorb this DISCOM, their mess, their financial issues into the state finance. We are supporting it. It's a kind of non-SLR bond we floated. But in that memorandum of understanding, financial efficiency and operational efficiency of the power sector, that was clearly mentioned. And there were parameters and targets related to that. Financial parameter in the sense, aggregate technical and commercial loss is very huge in the country. Even theft happens, technical loss can happen. We need to reduce that. That's one parameter. Second is aggregate revenue and aggregate cost. The gap is very huge. If you look into the dashboard, that's the only source where we get this data of power deficit or the power related indicators. In the dashboard, if you check all these parameters across states, we still know that the aggregate revenue and the aggregate cost, that gap is still huge. And tariff revisions is a political question, because ministers won't get into this tariff revisions because it can affect their calculus of consent. Voters will get affected. So tariff is not touched. Then on the operational parameters side, segregating the grid to the commercial and domestic purposes, putting smart meter, real-time measurement, a lot of things we need to do to monitor the power sector, but this is not done. So despite absorbing all these into the state government, the state deficits got worsened because of this power deficit or the power schemes, but these parameters, if you look into, that's still in a state of flux. So power sector structural reforms is very important. Second is employment, the labor codes. You know that without any tripartite consultations or anything, the labor codes were ad hocly decided, so we need to get into that. Then agriculture. We repealed those laws, and over 5 years we promised that we are going to increase the income of the farmers double, and we supported them with the cash transfers, targeted cash transfers, but these were not working. So another important thing is, for the first time, India is responding to the climate change commitments, because in Glasgow we committed that we are going to produce the first national adaptation communication for the first time. And I was telling Manju that I'm working with the ministry on this, and we need to produce that statement by November. So as a part of that, if agriculture sector is given importance, in that adaptation perspective, because in India also we don't, in Kerala also we don't have any ex-ante climate responsive budget in Kerala. What we do is mitigation. When a crisis happens, a disaster happens, we do mitigation. But adaptation is equally important. It's not, after the event you mitigate. So these are the sectors in which you need to look into in detail for the structural reforms. Now, it's not only the level of deficit that matters, how you finance the deficit is also equally a point of concern. For instance, in Sri Lanka, we have seen recently that things happened very bad, because external component of debt was very high in Sri Lanka. But in India, over the years, we have controlled the external debt. If you look at the financing pattern of deficit in India, over the years, external debt we have reduced to less than 1%, and the internal debt, you can take two decisions. One is you go to the RBI, print money and finance your deficit. We were doing that till late 80s. Then through the institutional reforms we have controlled the monetization of deficit, and now it is like bond financing. And important thing is, each of these modes of financing the deficit has got a peculiar macroeconomic consequence. For instance, if you print money, we call it technically seigniorage. Seigniorage is the change in high-powered money or reserve money to GDP. So that is seigniorage. So if you are seigniorage financing the deficit, then inflationary potential is going to be huge. But if you go ahead with the bond financing of deficits, then as I mentioned earlier, it can lead to crowding out, because you are preempting the resources to finance the fiscal deficit, which can lead to a kind of crunch in the resources available to the private sector, and it can shoot up interest rate. But as I mentioned, empirical evidence showed that this theory can be refuted in the context of emerging countries like India. Now, external, we have seen whatever happened in Sri Lanka, that China's presence was very huge, and they broke actually, and economists were asked whether what has happened in Sri Lanka is going to get repeated in India. No, we are a diverse economy. Our external component of deficit is negligible, and the use of deficit or the use of expenditure, now there is a big debate on freebies. How do you design your public expenditure is very crucial. One way you can argue is that revenue stability is important for public expenditure decisions. So whatever revenue you have, you were very cautious about your expenditure design. But that is a kind of erring on the side of caution, especially in the time of crisis. Revenues are uncertain. So if you don't have revenue, if you start expenditure compression, that can affect the growth recovery process, and that affects the financing of human development. So revenue stability is the base of expenditure design, that needs to be debated. Now, what's the source? You need to increase your debt or deficit threshold ratio. That's exactly what we are doing in India right now. Instead of that comfort of 3%, it has gone up to 9%, and now it has come down to 6%. So the use of deficit and substantiating that with the private capital formation in the country is a way we are doing it. And even Oliver Blanchard, that eminent macroeconomist, you may be aware of his work and text, Oliver Blanchard also, agreed to this point. And even prior to the pandemic in 2019 in the Atlanta American Economic Association conference, I was there, I presented my paper, and it was my privilege. In the last slide, he made two smart statements. One is, in the time of economic recession, if you have a fiscal rule, keep it as a contingent fiscal rule, don't use it. If you use it, growth recovery will suffer. Second, look into R and G, not into the threshold ratios. If you are comfortable with your R and G, then your debt is sustainable. So public debt is bad, that notion is wrong. If it is not bad, it is not, if it is not good, if it is not bad either. That's the way, he entered that presidential address. And those kind of concerns were incorporated even in the economic survey. So the India is now, based on those narratives, and Shija mentioned about my book on the fiscal consolidation, budget deficit and macroeconomy. And, in that book, the mood of that book is deficit is good because the impact of deficit on interest rate, the crowding out, the other variables were minimal. So a timely deficit is good. But the book was published in 2016. That time the country was not in a mood to listen to deficit is good narrative. That time FRBM boys, even my boss Ratin Roy, he was a part of that FRBM committee. The book was like, it was a mixed response. And the beauty of macroeconomics is that the neoclassicals alone doesn't rule. We have heterodox school of thought and CDS, where some of you may get into CDS for your higher studies. That's a heterodox school of thought. And there are many heterodox school of thought around the world, like University of Utah, then Kansas. There are many centers which believes in the heterodox school of thought, and they believe in a timely deficit. And there is a beautiful symposium published in Journal of Perspectives in 1986 by Janet Allen. Janet Allen, that paper, you should read that work. It's a symposium on deficits. So you will be able to understand what are the different theoretical aspects in which the deficit is accepted and refuted. So in that paper, Janet Allen also clearly mentioned about the three schools of thought, where, she also spoke about a Ricard inequivalence. Ricard inequivalence, right now I mentioned that neoclassical believes deficit is detrimental. Keynesians believe a timely deficit is good. But Ricardians believe, it doesn't matter whether you tax finance or deficit finance your, debt or public expenditure, because today's deficit is tomorrow's taxes. So in a way, it's going to have equal impact on the economy, but with a lag effect. So the concept is, it's a kind of a dynastic resources. It's an intergenerational equity model. So that's a way, Peter Diamond, a lot of works, look into those kind of aspects. But you need to understand the beauty of macroeconomics is there are many schools of thought. Where you fit in there. You don't have to worry about anything. And if your data speaks what you want to provide, then you are empirically substantiating what you believe in. So there is not like 2 + 2, like 4, like deterministic physics kind of a model. Because yesterday also we were discussing in Ivanis that it's a stochasticity. The beauty of economics or econometric models is it's a stochastic model. You know that error term, right? Something is a function of many variables, but that error term is there. So that stochasticity. So that's the beauty of doing this econometric models and functionings. Now, yesterday's Jackson Hole meeting were reported by Geeta Gopinath. If you go to the Twitter, there is a 1 minute or some seconds video. So she came and reported what are the important takeaways of the Jackson Hole meeting happened yesterday. One is, it's a kind of a beggar thy neighbor kind of an approach, because if they increase the interest rate, the fragile economies like Turkey, India, Brazil, we all will be into trouble if you don't defend. Interest rate defense is very important. And you must be asking me in the similar situations how we reacted earlier. Earlier, when this kind of high interest rate happened from the western side, we didn't do an interest rate defense. We did a capital defense. We went ahead with the capital controls. We intervene in the exchange rate markets and we try to stabilize the rupee, because otherwise free fall of rupee is a concern. Otherwise, if the rupee fluctuates and it comes to a normal point on its own, it's okay. But if it's free fall, then we need to intervene from RBI. So these were the ways in which we tried to stabilize, but those didn't work. So right now, how to prevent the capital flight, how to build up the investors' confidence, then the argument is that keep your macroeconomic fundamentals strong. And what are the macroeconomic fundamentals? Yours, current account deficit, fiscal deficit, the inflation, all these things are the macroeconomic fundamentals. So if the macroeconomic fundamentals are strong, you won't repeat a Sri Lankan experience. You won't get into the perpetuating this capital flight from your country. So focus on macroeconomic fundamentals. Now, due to the geopolitical uncertainties, due to the energy price volatility, now inflation is mounting. And in our country, since 2016 February, we entered into an agreement. The Ministry of Finance and the RBI entered into an agreement, and as per that new monetary policy framework, it's called NMF. It's a new monetary policy framework. RBI needs to focus only on inflation containment. Price stability is the sole decision of RBI. Nothing else. Exchange rate fluctuations, growth, regulatory mechanisms, everything is taken away from the purview of RBI. But now scholars are questioning that. Are we able to anchor the inflationary expectations and keep that inflation contained in the economy? Because now the nominal anchor, that means officially permitted inflation in India, that nominal anchor is 4%. And we have a band of plus or minus 2. So up to 6% we are comfortable. But beyond 6% in many countries, RBI governor or the central bank, chair, they need to come and defend why this inflation is above that in the, Niyama Sabha, whatever parliamentary process they have to tell. Otherwise, if he's keeping it, he'll get bonus also. So that's the way it's a political process in other country. In India, now consecutively 3 quarters, inflation is above the comfort zone, but they are not giving any explanation. So it's like mounting. And now you can ask me, inflation is a strict monetary phenomenon in our country. If monsoon fails, we had inflation. If there is energy price volatility, we have inflation, food inflation. So how can this repo rate adjustments can anchor the inflationary expectations and control inflation in the context? So these are the questions asked, and I know that Siddharth is working on that. Like instead of having a price stability, he's working with you that we will have a GDP targeting, the output targeting instead of inflation targeting. So these are the beautiful questions now coming up because we are unable to anchor the inflationary expectations, because it is beyond the comfort zone. And there are 2 inflation index. One is WPI and the other is CPI. So RBI is concerned only about CPI. Now if you look into the divergence between WPI and CPI, it's huge. So that affects the business sentiments and the entrepreneurs, if that is huge, because RBI looks only into the CPI. So these are the questions and concerns. Then, Ashima Goyal, one of the MPC members, she defended that what happened prior to the inflation targeting framework. Siddharth is smiling, he knows about that debate. So she argued that earlier our CPI was mounting, WPI was okay. Now WPI is mounting, CPI is okay. So everything is under control because we are able to control the inflationary expectations. But otherwise, if the RBI doesn't have a clear mandate like this, then fiscal policy, monetary policy coordination will be a tough thing. Because everything is rule based now. We have done a transition in the macroeconomic policy from the discretionary to rules based. In the sense, as I mentioned earlier, fiscal policy is rules based because we have a threshold ratio for the deficit. Inflation targeting, again rules based, a Taylor rule and all you will learn in the due course, and it is depending on you peg your interest rate based on that inflationary anchor, its deviation from inflationary expectations and output gap. So in that model itself, two variables are unobserved. So how do you tackle unobserved variables in economics? One is inflationary expectations. Then we started doing expectation survey. I was also the part of the expectation survey. It's subjective. RBI conducts expectation survey. And on the output gap, it's a difference between potential output and actual output. Actual output, you know that you get the GDP number, that is your GVA plus Fisc. GVA means gross value added, plus Fisc is indirect taxes minus subsidies. It's a very clear definition. But what about potential GDP? How do you measure this? We were talking in the car when I was coming to the center with Siddharth. It's a very messy thing. That's what we were discussing. Using econometric methodology, using the filters, they take this GDP series. GDP series has got a trend component and a cyclical component. So using this filters methodology, they take out the cyclicality and call this trend as the potential GDP. But potential of a country is not that trend, it is an envelope. So how do you capture that? So these are, and it's a controversial, this output gap, macroeconomists always grapple with, and Mihir Rakshit, he always pointed out that how do you capture output gap? And is that a very comfortable variable in macroeconomics? Because this you need to correlate with what I explained earlier on the business cycles. If you don't have any clear business cycles, then the output gap as a concept fails. These are the concerns, and people now look into hysteresis as a new model of studying the economic growth. Hysteresis in the sense, it's a dependence of economy on history. Like the long-term and the short-term dynamics, they are interrelated. So that's a way, they get into these details. Now, winding up, I will wind up by saying the final point. There are two important paradigms or two important, ways in which we can tackle this fiscal monetary policy coordination. And you have to think where you fit in. On one side, let fiscal policy be the first mover. Let's give the advantage to the fiscal policy as the first mover. Monetary policy follows. So it helps in deficit support or whatever, supporting the inflation containment for the fiscal policy to support the growth recovery. That's what we call as, unpleasant monetary arithmetic. I will tell you why it is unpleasant. On the other hand, we have an unpleasant fiscal arithmetic. In that sense, the first mover advantage is given to the central bank independence. Fiscal policy is just a supportive policy. So that is unpleasant fiscal arithmetic. And you need to understand who should get the first mover advantage in the context of emerging country like India. And why I said the monetary arithmetic is unpleasant, because if you are bond financing the deficit, you cannot go on with bond financing beyond the point of R and G. If the R gets greater than G, then you have to eventually monetize your deficit. So inflation today or inflation tomorrow, that's only flexibility you have. That's why they call this monetary arithmetic unpleasant. And you will be reading all this. It's a Nobel winning, it's a very beautiful literature, and you will read all these things in future. So, we have to either live with unpleasant fiscal arithmetic or unpleasant monetary arithmetic. But so far, there is no significant clue we have given to the central bank that you will get the 100% autonomy. So what independence do they seek? They seek only operational independence, because instead of governor announcing the policies, now we have an MPC, a monetary policy committee. So they seek that operational independence. There's a voting process, but goal independence is not there for the monetary policy stance. So I stop here and look forward to interacting if you have any pressing concerns. Yeah. As Meera mentioned, monetary policy, they are very skeptical about incorporating climate change into the monetary policy reaction function, because as I mentioned earlier, globally the focus is on inflation targeting and price stability. So they don't want to complicate the model, but the moment you get into the financial stability, as you mentioned, this climate change related risk and uncertainties is getting into the financial stability. So then if you get into the distinguishing between the green and the brown bonds, that will go political. How much such political economy decisions can be taken by a central bank chief or a governor That's a question. So these are the issues. So excuse me. And you ask me, if that is the case, if that lead to the reputation risk of the policymaker, monetary policy maker, then what can fiscal policy do about it? In India, for the first country ever, we have designed this ecological fiscal transfers. Ecological fiscal transfers in the sense, in the intergovernmental fiscal transfer mechanism, a criteria related to climate change was incorporated. So that ecological fiscal transfer, that acceptance is beautiful. Now, what are the other kinds of models? And as I mentioned earlier, we need to get into climate responsive budgeting. And maybe, I don't know, Orissa has done a climate responsive budgeting because they have a lot of risk related to the natural disasters. So I'm waiting that if we have a statement in the context of Kerala regarding this climate change related risk and uncertainties, and we start doing an adaptation and mitigation related climate change commitments. Now, this climate change is also an ongoing process. We need to debate it wider because greening the monetary policy is becoming a huge issue. Fiscal Council, I do agree with you because budget credibility is becoming a huge issue now, and the institutional mechanisms which looked into the budget credibility is always fiscal councils. And budget credibility in the sense, finance minister can announce many things but may not be backed up with proper allocation. So when we look into the budget numbers after 1 year, you can even technically you can do fiscal marksmanship analysis, and we have done in NIPFP for all the state governments and central government. I can send you that paper. So we understood that the sources of errors, fiscal forecasting errors, were mostly random, related to many variables, many macro fiscal variables, but related to the intergovernmental fiscal transfers, related to capital spending and tax projections. These were the three variables in which there was a bias of policymaker and there was a clear budget credibility issue. So if that is a bias of the policymaker, then we need to change the assumptions models. If it is random, then it's beyond the capacity of a policymaker. So those issues we need to look into, and that Fiscal Council needs to work it out, the budget credibility issues, and like a watchdog. As we have autonomous institutes like NIPFP, where I work. It's a kind of a Ministry of Finance institute. So we do that work right now, but I do strongly argue for fiscal councils. But Isaac sir is not comfortable with the idea of fiscal council because he is telling that one way you have already suffocated the cooperative federalism model by getting into the fiscal rules. Then you further complicated the model by asking the state governments, nudging the state governments to go to the market to find funds. Earlier, when you do that Maxgravian function in the public economics, macroeconomic stabilization function is a function of center government. But now, states are exposed to the macroeconomic uncertainties. So states are exposed to these. And we transfer certain funds for the capital spending, front loading that capital spending from the center government, but that's not enough. That model is completely now changed. It's not a competitive federalism. It isn't cooperative federalism either. An important question asked by Sneha on K-shaped. It's a very important question because in India, it's an uneven recovery process because in the time of pandemic, as you mentioned, it was clearly a K-shaped recovery. We didn't get the U-shaped recovery. So now, uneven growth recovery process is our concern. And in the economic stimulus packages, if you look into, the prime narrative was credit, the liquidity infusion in the economy. And who accessed the credit? And liquidity infusion was to which sectors? The prime narrative, that itself shows that the recovery is going to get uneven. Then how can you prevent that? How can you prevent this humanitarian crisis? How can you work out with the people at the lower end of the pyramid? So those kind of clear conscious public policy decisions related to, we mentioned last time also, related to the social infrastructure policies, social protection policies, then food security measures, because otherwise it's civil war. We proudly say that we have not done any economic stimulus packages which led to overheating of economy, but Janet Yellen's policy, see the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's policy in US that led to the overheating of economy, inflationary, but they tackled, maybe through the direct cash transfers or child credit or whatever it is. But we are proudly saying that we are not, this is not led to the overheating of economy, but what's the policy narratives for preventing an uneven recovery, which I hope that governments will take it serious. At the subnational governments, of course, yes, many state governments have supported, these policies, but center government, I hope. And it was very weird to listen to one policymaker who is a part of PMAC as well. Her narrative was that we cannot cross-subsidize. What do you mean by cross-subsidize? Like only a 4% of people were paying taxes, so we cannot cross-subsidize much. We are sorry that things are happening, poor people are there. No, poor people do pay taxes. In the tax structure, if you look into indirect taxes, the contribution is also very huge. So that kind of an argument that we cannot cross-subsidize in India, those arguments are terribly wrong. So we are doing within our own limits. Like I belong to Finance Ministry, Autonomous Institute, but we within our purview we say that things, those kind of arguments contains its own dangers. But you are right. It's an uneven recovery process, and across countries we have done, I was telling Manju that we have done a study for UN unpacking the economic stimulus packages, that how much it's focusing on the humanitarian crisis. No, it was focusing on the economic growth criteria. So that itself will show that the recovery is going to be uneven. It's like irreversible loss for the small and medium term enterprises and the people in the poor income households, and we need to have policies for them. I hope I answered all your concerns. Yes, thank you so much.